Imagine this. You're told to press a button. Every time you do, someone in the next room screams like they're being tortured. A calm voice says, "The experiment requires that you continue." What do you do? For the unlucky volunteers in one of psychology's most infamous experiments, this wasn't a thought exercise. It was real. And it only gets darker. Today, we're diving into the most disturbing psychological experiments ever run. These weren't just unethical, they were manipulative, traumatic, and often straight up abusive. And somehow they still shaped what we believe about human nature. For decades, textbook psychology leaned on a handful of breakthrough studies, ones that supposedly proved we're obedient, violent, tribal, or broken by fear. But behind the headlines were real people, not lab rats. People who were pushed, scarred, and sometimes shattered, all in the name of science. Let's start with one of the most notorious, the Stanford Prison Experiment. You've probably heard this one. In 1971, college students were split into guards and prisoners in a fake jail run by psychologist Philip Zimbardo. Within days, the guards were reportedly turning sadistic, and the whole thing was shut down early. The lesson: power corrupts fast. But here's what they left out. Zimbardo didn't just observe the abuse. He encouraged it. As warden, he told guards to get aggressive. He also made it psychologically difficult for participants to leave despite telling them they could. So instead of proving that humans naturally become monsters, the experiment mostly showed what happens when the guy in charge pulls the strings. Today, it's widely seen not as science, just an improv scene that no one wanted to be in. And if that shook your faith in psychological research, buckle up, it gets worse. Because the next one didn't just simulate pain, it faked torture. In the early 60s at Yale, Stanley Milgram wanted to understand obedience. His setup: a participant, the teacher, had to give electric shocks to another person, the learner, for every wrong answer. With each mistake, the voltage increased. Screams followed. Eventually, silence. And yet, a calm authority figure simply repeated, "The experiment requires that you continue." The shocking takeaway: 65% of participants delivered what they thought was a potentially fatal 450-volt shock, just because someone told them to. The emotional toll was brutal. Many were visibly distressed, sweating, shaking, begging to stop. But it gets worse. Milgram's debriefing was trash. Participants were left believing they'd actually hurt someone. And later analysis suggests he cherry-picked the most dramatic cases, ignoring people who said no. So what did it prove? That people are obedient? Maybe. But mostly it showed how far one researcher would go to create a sensational headline at the expense of human beings. Now, if that sounds cruel, at least those were consenting adults. The next experiment? They went after a baby. In 1920, psychologist John B. Watson set out to prove fear could be taught. His subject: a 9-month-old baby known as Little Albert. At first, Albert was fine with soft animals, but then Watson paired a white rat with a loud, terrifying noise, smashing a steel bar behind the child every time he reached for it. Soon, Albert was crying at the mere sight of the rat. The fear then spread to dogs, rabbits, even a man in a Santa beard. And then Watson walked away. No reconditioning, no follow-up. He installed a phobia in a baby and called it a win. But hey, why stop at traumatizing one child when you can ruin dozens? Let's talk about the one so cruel it was buried for 60 years. In 1939, researchers ran a stuttering study on 22 children in an Iowa orphanage. One group got praise for fluent speech. The other, kids who didn't even stutter, were told they had a speech problem and were relentlessly criticized. The result? Some of those kids developed anxiety, speech issues, and lifelong trauma, all because someone wanted to test a theory The student who ran the sessions, Mary Tudor, was so racked with guilt, she went back 3 times to try to undo the harm. It was a study on speech that ended up breaking psyches. And if you're still wondering, okay, but do any of these involve punching clowns? Yes, they do. In the 1960s, Albert Bandura wanted to test if aggression could be learned. So he showed preschoolers an adult beating up a clown shaped punching bag named Bobo, hitting, kicking, yelling. Then he left the kids alone with Bobo. They didn't just copy the violence, they got creative. New attacks, new weapons. The study proved kids can learn aggression by watching others, but it also taught kids aggression. There was no consent, no long term follow up, and no way to know what kind of impact it left behind. Last one. It's summer camp. You're 11. Everything seems normal until the adults turn you into enemies. In 1954, psychologist Muzafer Sherif took 22 boys to summer camp, split them into 2 groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers, and let them bond. Then he sparked a war. Sheriff introduced competitions, pitted the groups against each other, and watched the boys turn hostile. Name calling, flag burning, cabin raids. The prejudice wasn't discovered. It was engineered. To his credit, Sheriff later forced cooperation to reduce tensions, but the boys had no idea they were being manipulated the entire time. It was a social experiment wrapped in betrayal. These stories aren't quirky psychology trivia. They're human tragedies that shaped science, and they forced research to grow a conscience. If you want the truth behind the headlines and the hidden stories that shaped our world, hit like, subscribe, and stay curious. These studies crossed lines we wouldn't dream of touching today. They exploited babies, children, and vulnerable people, and they taught us a brutal lesson. Science without ethics is just cruelty in a lab coat. So the next time you hear someone casually reference one of these classic experiments, remember the other side of the story. The one with trauma, manipulation, and the human cost behind the data. Thanks for watching.